We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Ness Sequeira. She is the head of people design at Miro. Ness, thank you for being on the show. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Christina, thank you so much for having me. So lovely to be here. I'm Ness Sequeira, and my pronouns are she and her. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be an environmental scientist. At heart, I am still a corporate hippie, so I'm very passionate about climate change and the circular economy. And I think where it came when I was younger is we had one of my friend's mothers, who was a scientist, come into our class in grade 5 and talk about acid rain and climate change. And I think I was shocked, but also really inspired. So that was a kind of nerdy aspiration as I think a 9-year-old or 8-year-old. Yeah.
A 9-year-old talking about acid rain. I love to see it, and I love the term corporate hippie as well. I'm gonna use that too.
Please do.
If you fast forward to now, then how do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point to be specifically at Miro and leading kind of the people design function and team?
Yeah, well, I think it's a long journey. Could start anywhere from childhood, but maybe I'll start more around maybe my university time and experience. So I started studying biomedical science, and as much as I am a science nerd, I love biology and chemistry and biochemistry and neuroscience in the brain. I was just like, this isn't quite for me, and I was really interested in more psychology and what makes people tick. And I always knew that I'd love the idea of more organizational psychology. And so rather than looking at business or commerce as a degree, I was like, even if we understand business or commerce, it's that element of behavior that really, all of the financial models of the world can't always predict human behavior. So that was part of my journey. So I was doing that at the University of Melbourne, and then I moved to London. I think what really shaped me, I have to be honest, is graduating at the end of the global financial crisis. 18% unemployment amongst skilled graduates. So I had to just be really gritty and think about different avenues. So more entrepreneurial avenues. I started my own fashion styling business. I was teaching yoga because every so often I just go do 3-month ashrams in India. My heritage is Indian. And so that just taught me a lot of grit, as well as I moved to London. I knew no one. My mum was there, but she worked in more academic and she was a teacher. It's like, how do I get a job? And someone just introduced me to LinkedIn back in the day. So it's 2010. And I just started networking and reaching out to people, hoping someone would, have some take sort of pity on like this random Australian who'd come to London. And so I think that real piece of being gritty and experimenting and wasn't so much being willing to fail, but just looking at how do I survive and succeed and sort of make my way really shaped me. And then I was lucky enough to land my first role as a business psychologist, and I fell in love with the field of organizational development. But then what shaped me is that I think I moved back to Melbourne, Australia years later, joined the wonderful world of Big Four consulting. I was at Deloitte, and I have to be honest, I got really disillusioned with the people space, and I'll be quite transparent about that, because I'd work, with different leaders or clients or different people in the product space, and they were designing products or strategies that seemed logically like they were correct, but they weren't designed with and for people. And I was like, you can't make this stick. I can't make people like go do the people-y things, the comms, the training, the culture. I think, and they tried to divorce all of that from the internal sort of hard strategy. And I just kind of got disillusioned from that space. And I think what shaped me at that point is I found sort of my people at Deloitte who were the human-centered design team. And back in the day, I didn't know it's called human-centered design, but as a psychologist, designing with and for people seems pretty logical. But then I fell in love with that space of discovery, my favorite phase of the design process, then distilling, prototyping, and that sort of led me to more customer-centric experiences and working with our agile software software development teams and sort of finance software. And then I just fell in love with the agile space of how do we use more bootstrapped, how we look at customer centricity, but not trying to forecast too far in the future. We do like have that vision, but really bootstrapping and understanding what impacts people. So I think that shaped me is that journey from people, but then more into a design and then agile and software sort of technology space. And then I helped build with one of my partners and colleagues, Chris Webb, the Agile Advisory practice at PwC Australia, where it's just like, how do we design better business? And I think it's sort of these T-shaped experiences and pivots that I think have led me to people design at Miro, which is a team of agile coaches. So bringing in sort of my tech, process and business operating model, organizational design experience, as well as sort of the underpinning of that in terms of culture, people, behavioral psychology, behavioral economics.
I love that. I think there's a good mix of psychology, and you're right to create this like premier employee kind of experience. I like the phrasing of people design because it is about inclusive design. It's about looking at the whole system, like you said, not siloing things out to say, okay, this is the people space, this is the HR space, but then also this is the business strategy. They're in order for the business to be successful, your people feel like they're supported, that they're happy. How do you kind of tangibly define and really measure a quote unquote world-class people design strategy? What does that look like in practice for you at Miro?
It's a good question. I think talking about, I was having a chat with my team, one of the pods that I lead, which just looks at global onboarding, and we're looking at sort of their strategy. And a question I ask them before we start sort of refining and developing is what does strategy mean to you? And I think when we say it's a loaded word for some people, and different people have different ideas of strategy. And how I look at it is, I know if you're aware of sort of Michael Watkins' work. So he does a lot of work in sort of, first 90 days and your next move, and it's like a great organizational, I suppose, theorist, development theorist. And he really talks about strategic direction. So that's the mission and the goals of the what of the company, the value and the network, the who, the vision, incentives of the why. And he calls that the strategic direction, along with the strategy as the how. So I think I like to, when we're saying strategy, kind of look at that overarching picture. So back to your question, if we're looking at strategic direction, and well, it's obviously defining the who, the vision and the mission, but then in the pure strategy, how we tangibly are defining that is, I suppose, looking at what needs to be done in terms of the how. Once we've got, here's Miro's vision and mission, what is our vision and mission, but then how do we go about that in sort of cross-functional pods or teams? So we have the onboarding pod, we're looking at empowered teams, a coaching pod, leadership development pod, company enablement pod, and thriving hubs and community pod. So for each of them, sort of we're on that space of, in our strategy that scaffolds back to the company strategy and mission, how do we look at what is sort of the business model? Because something that's different about our teams is I see them as products and services teams. Just as Miro is a product and service, culture and culture services are products and services. They're not projects. They generally don't have a start and finish, maybe like an engagement survey, start and finish, but onboarding, leadership experience, most employee experiences, they're services that we're developing. So looking at themselves as product teams. And so they're thinking then, as my strategy of the how am I also looking at maybe having a business model canvas to look at how we're doing our people team and people experience as a service rather than projects. So that's one part of the strategy and how. Then my favorite is, my team will probably be sick of it, I talk about the crawl, walk, run roadmap. So yes, you've got tangible roadmaps, but I look at phases of maturities. Yes, we want to get to this awesome automation or X or Y in the experience, but how are we looking at where we need to go in the strategy around how in different time blocks of crawl, walk, run maturity? And importantly, how does that marry back to not just what we think are chunks or components of work for a service, but the business viability, what matters to the business impact, tightly coupled with customer desirability of our employees. And then, of course, project, process and technology feasibility. So I think these are more of the how componentry, if you like, of how we're trying to run, I suppose, agile or adaptive teams that are really product focused or service focused people teams. So that's a bit about the strategy. In terms of how we measure that, measurement is is the golden standard in the employee experience space. It's, you know, it's different. It's not like customer acquisition or hitting like a numeric target necessarily. So I look at measurement once again using how we're measuring different components of business viability or business impact, customer desirability, feasibility. But then most of our experience, we use Kirkpatrick's model of for either learning or just people experiences in general. So level 1 and 2 are people aware and satisfied, and they're having sort of transfer of that experience, whether it's learning or otherwise, or knowledge management, for example. And then the bigger levels of measurement that are harder to do are obviously behavior change, how we're really tracking and measuring that, and business impact. And then there's some people solutions where I think it's potentially more visible, so such as leadership enablement, and potentially onboarding. And then there's other people solutions that are so important, like how you build community and thriving hubs, which one of our team members, Anna Dvornikova, leads. That's a harder space to lead, but I often say culture and community connection doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. And I think that culture and community space, which one of my colleagues, Colleen Curtis, leads externally, I think that community externally for SaaS companies is really strong. It's how do we get that same mindset and measurement internally, that this and other people experience is a bit of the holy grail. So I think for most of that, it's kind of looking at those levels of sort of desirability, feasibility, viability, as well as looking at sort of that model of reported satisfaction to true business impact and behavioral change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely makes sense. And kind of your analogy or reframing, just thinking about the people design, people and culture teams as product and service teams instead of projects, I think is really important, because there is no, gold standard where you check the box and say, okay, we're done creating this great culture, we don't have to work on it anymore. It's definitely intentional, and you have to continue to work on it, especially as you scale. It also sounds like you really need to have that framework in place with kind of thinking of it as a funnel in terms of your definition of strategy, what the goals are, what you're trying to accomplish, and then looking back at those to see how you're measuring against them. I also saw that in terms of leadership and the world of work that we're in right now, you wrote an article or co-wrote an article around the digital workspace. This is not something new, but something that people are finding is kind of a newer experience for them individually. Can you give an example of how leaders can like really lead with their head, hearts, and hands?
Well, first shout out to my co-author, Jenny Fernando. I think we had a lot of fun writing that article, and we're building a whole sort of model and playbook on it. So lovely human to work with. But in terms of how leaders can lead with heads, hearts, and hands, so maybe I'll start with hearts first. For me personally, the team comes first. Like beyond your schedule, the team comes first. I come from a sporting background. I'm a basketballer, and that's where I think I fell in love with this space, and that's what shaped me. Back to your first question or second question as well. But if you lead truly with heart and the team comes first, you're looking about, we've heard all of the good research, etc., about psychological safety, but if the team comes first, then that means looking at their team health. So psychological safety, leading for inclusion, actively listening to your team. There's just so many pieces that are critical for a leader, because you build the foundations through team health and what I kind of call like Bryant's work around the truth trust cycle. The more you give a bit of truth and create that space and build trust as a team, the more truth you give, the more trust there is, and it's like a virtuous cycle. So I think that is the number one thing leaders need to do, is just the team comes first. If you lose the team, you lose the game or whatever business you're in, sports, industry, startups, otherwise. So I think that's my number one thing for leaders leading with heart, and really putting psychological safety and crucial conversations. That's something we've really looked at in our team. So vulnerable conversations with radical candor. I think that real heart is like, Brene Brown's work, which one of my team members leads just so admirably, where, clear is kind and unclear is unkind. So I think that sort of level of safety and discussion, it's not all about just warm spaces, it's about real spaces. In terms of head, I think it's looping back to your former question, it's really about leading with vision and strategic direction, and then also strategy. So people want to know what's the North Star, because that gives people purpose. Like, what are we aiming towards? That's why I come to stickiness, to my team, to my place. And then the how, yes, the how scaffolds back to that. So I think leading with strategy and vision is important, but those are just generally words or metrics on a piece of paper, or hopefully a Miro board. What I think is just as important leading with head is being able to connect as a leader. Here's where we want to go. Here's our vision. Here's the roadmap, crawl, walk, run. But then what is my team's performance and team's capability? Where are they in terms of their team maturity of forming, storming, norming, performing? And what is, like, if you look at like this, my inner psychologist coming out, Lev Vygotsky's work in terms of the zone of proximal development. So here's what they can do, here's what they can't do unassisted. Like, what's that zone of proximal development where you push them? Because the only way you get to the strategy is a competent team. And that doesn't just mean skilled individuals, it also means the team meshing together. So I think the leader thinking with their head and strategically is, what is the strategy? Where do we need to go? And then how do I get the team to a level of empowered, autonomous team capable to do that work and marry both together. And I think I've seen leaders do one or the other, just focus on team and not strategy, or just focus on strategy and be like, well, why aren't we getting there? Why aren't we achieving? And not balancing both team and strategy sort of maturity together. And then in terms of hands, I think one of the hardest things to do in terms of hypergrowth environments, but any environment or any business I've worked for or consulted to in the past, is prioritization and deprioritization. More so deprioritize. We can prioritize, here are our big rocks, here are our chunks of work, here's the strategy, but things evolved, COVID hits, macro shocks happen in our environment, global financial crisis, some sort of world-changing event, or even minor events. And that ability to continuously reconfigure, prioritize priorities and depriorities, and get your hands stuck in to help customers, to help the business, but to help your team, I think is one of the most important things a leader can do. And I know for me, it's a continual journey of like making that dedicated time to prioritize, deprioritize, and give really clear guardrails or acceptance criteria so the team can be autonomous and empowered in their work.
Absolutely. I think something I learned, especially, or re-emphasized, I should say, over the past year is that if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. That's not prioritizing a list as well. If you're trying to do a million different things and you're going in so many directions. And I think in terms of really leaders and managers setting up those guardrails, and I was talking to someone earlier too about non-negotiables, that's really important for setting the team up for success, and goes to your earlier point of putting the team first, putting the people at the beginning of the strategy there too. And we know that during this time, a lot of folks are reflecting on the work that they're doing, who they're working with, and there's a conversation in the US too going around the Great Resignation around a lot of folks. I think it's the status around 55% of Americans are either looking or anticipate they're going to switch jobs over the next year. As you're looking at kind of this data, I know Miro is a global company, but has this impacted your kind of people design strategy in any way?
Like, once again, I think strategy, if we're looking at time in terms of the roadmap and that sort of crawl, walk, run maturity, for sure, we need to look at macro environmental pressures or changes. I think the interesting thing about Miro is the absolute hypergrowth of the company happened during COVID. So most of our employees, including myself, have all joined remotely, have all worked with flexibility. So I'd say to date, it's just been part of the DNA in terms of the flexibility and that sort of space. I think where we go in the future, like most companies, is it sort of like a hybrid, a distributed, is it a hub-centric model to build community, is really important. And I think how we design for connection and belonging, that is what we're looking for in our strategy. So irrespective of flexibility or in office or remote or whatever hybrid that is, what people are craving is that sense of belonging and inclusivity. So I think that's sort of the macro theme of where we're going with it. So for us, it's really around how it affects us more probably through design. principles, belonging, inclusivity, but also how do we make experiences sticky? So if people are wanting flexibility, at least through our solutions, how are we looking not just at flexibility, whether it's location or remote, but how are we looking at flexibility of just-in-time learning or coaching in times of need? So it doesn't seem like a burden from the people solutions design team, but something that actually the people are grasping towards. So I think that's one level of stickiness. But I think for the bigger question, looping back to the great resignation, something that our team has prototyped because we felt we need to have the conversation is like work life by design. So I think what a lot of people are nervous looking at a lot of the trends and reading is the loss of, like you said, flexibility. So it's like, let's have that conversation. What are the principles we adhere to, or what does a manager or a leader say, like, here's what's important. So for my team, it was around, I said, when we're doing our work life by design, it's around well-being. It's around avoiding peak hour traffic because that doesn't help anyone. It's around balancing collaboration time, which is important to our business, with focus time. And it's about maintaining our sense of team connection. And the fifth one was around maintaining a sense of hub or community connection with your local area. I said, based on that, like, design your ideal 2 weeks. And then we all shared our ideal 2 weeks when we'd be in office, when we'd be picking up kids, when we would be doing sports and training. And then it was that beautiful mesh, like, how do we mesh that together? I think that's what people are scared of, is not having the conversation. And as humans, we're all triggered by loss aversion. We don't want to lose something. So it's like, let's just have the conversation of what are you running towards and what are you scared we're going to lose? And then how do we marry that together? So that's a solution we've developed and we're currently testing the business. And then we hope to open up to people everywhere via Miroverse, so people can have probably one of the most important conversations you can be having as a leader with your team in the next 12 months.
Absolutely. And it could be a hard conversation. It's a vulnerable conversation, talking about kind of your work life by design. I love that you didn't use the term like work-life balance. I've heard people use work-life blend just to keep it more realistic, but it's about a design. It's about intentional, inclusive design too. This doesn't just happen if you don't have these conversations and then act on this feedback. And there's a ton of research around when people feel more connected to their teams, to the work, and they are more inspired and likely to stay at a company as well. For yourself as a leader of a team, I'm sure a lot of people kind of look to you for that modeling and example. How do you think about kind of measuring the effectiveness of yourself as a leader and also evaluating people leaders at this time to say, okay, they are, measuring their progress and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think so the first part was around, I think I just want to talk about something you said as well. Like, you're glad I didn't mention work-life balance. I so resonate with you. I love that you've said that, because this is controversial, but I think the word or the term work-life balance sets people up for mental failure, because how often do we reach full balance in our lives? And for me, it's about work-life centeredness. So when you're working, like, you're in the zone, you're hopefully reaching a level of flow. And when you're doing non-work stuff, like, even if it's 30 minutes, you're switched off, you're spending time with your family, your friends, your kids, your sport. And I think that centeredness, it's kind of that blurring. Your mind doesn't know that you've left work or that you're in leisure. So I think it's about centeredness. So I think we really resonate together. It's not about quantity, it's about quality, and looking at sort of levels of what is equilibrium, rather than saying I didn't achieve balance today or last day. But to your actual question, which was around how do I measure my leadership effectiveness, and then how do we think about evaluating people leaders? So first, my effectiveness, I think when we think of measurement, I think we're still stuck in a static mindset around measures at time points. So my first point is just continuous feedback. So something I definitely want to get even better at is checking in with my team of, is this helpful? How am I being perceived? Like, what is the support they need, sort of that inverted pyramid of leadership. And so I think it's that continual checks in with the team, and also then peers and my senior leaders as well, and having those conversations in existing one-to-one meetings or teaming sessions. Something I implement as well as an agilist is I love a good retro to inspect and adapt what can be better. It's not just about products in your team. I think it's about yourself. So I've scheduled every Friday, it's 30 minutes, a ways of working retro with myself. Like, hey, what am I doing well as a leader? Where am I perhaps not quite hitting the mark around certain elements? And what actions do I want to take? And then I just, like you do in a retro, put 1 or 2 actions in place. And then I just check in with my team. Hey, have you noticed that, based on their feedback, that I'm listening more and asking questions, or I'm responding? So I put I think sometimes you get so bombarded with messages, I put like a service level agreement on myself, like respond to everything within 24 hours. So like just measuring, like, is there continuous improvement there? Obviously there's the opportunity for 360s, and I definitely look at our engagement survey and pulse surveys from my team, and any of the elements that affect like direct leadership feedback, but also just themes like if around well-being or passion in work, because that's my job to create that environment. And then finally, it's around performance review. So not just what people have said about you, but I think as a leader, when you're writing other people's performance reviews, there's also a reflection there of like, where did I support, or where could I have supported more? And that's a very real time when you're writing. I think it's one of the most crucial things you can do is write a performance review. People have given you hundreds of hours of their time before that review. So it's a real reflection on yourself and where you can support more or where you have supported. So that's sort of, I'd say that's a similar model to some of the different components we use in measuring people leaders at Miro. But we're also trying to introduce like a basic leadership construct of how are you measuring how you lead self, how you lead teams, how you lead individuals, but then how are you leading for culture and organization? And I think some people do that naturally, and for some people it's a scaffold step, like it's generally more me, my team, my environment, but how we're looking at leading the bigger ecosystem. And so then we have to think about measurements of that as well as we mature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that if you want to know how people are feeling, you need to ask in a variety of ways, whether it's one-on-ones, the pulse surveys you were talking about, the employee sentiment survey, the performance reviews is a good way to reflect for yourself as a leader as well. And it's an ongoing conversation because those touch points are at a period of time. And I definitely want to ask too, when we're talking about just feedback, giving and receiving constructive feedback, you're creating this kind of workplace that has a lot of trust and transparency. How do you see this culture of employee kind of listening and feedback manifesting in your organization? Why is it important?
Yeah. Well, I think we touched on this before of thinking about people experience and culture as a product that's iterated. So the only reason the way you really truly iterate a product properly is around listening and participatory design. So I think that's something that's strong. Examples of this is the executive themselves. They put like a 3-year vision document together. The FY24 is an example, a painted picture, but then it's like they might come up with some of the meat and potatoes or the bones of that, but then there's participatory design by the extended leadership team, and then all employees have a chance to kind of look at it and give feedback. So that's like right at the top, the vision and strategy level. And then more different examples of that in terms of really listening and understanding what the organization, the heartbeat is about 6 months ago, we did a values and behaviors refresh. And it wasn't just like the people team going, oh, here's some values we think is like, here's a piece. And it was 6 months of co-design with the organization in last year's summer offsite, in focus groups, so that real participatory design. And another example is our return to hubs at the moment. So there were hub hackathons in our most recent offsite where people came together. So it's like, I think a lot of our listening is follow-up sessions and listening, but also listening by active doing. So I think there are some examples of why listening and active design is important. I think where suppose we hope to go in the future, actually we're doing that now, is like training a lot of leaders in active listening and radical candor, and we would like to go in the future to really deepen this muscle of active listening. It's like the hardest thing you can do. Is more of the Dare to Lead work by Brené Brown. So like I said, a team member who's phenomenal, Dorothy Mankey in our team is a certified trainer, and she's just changed, I think, the trust in the face of collaboration in the people design team. And that's something we hope to bring to the company at large. Is like everyone can say active listening and feedback, but having the understanding of what sort of your resistance or armor is, and then having that vocabulary that makes it safe for teams to listen and give that feedback is, I think that's the aspiration in the coming years.
Absolutely. I love that you brought up Brene Brown a couple times too, because I always have, especially in hard conversations, the language, the story I'm telling myself is this. I'm sure that's the story you're telling yourself. Oftentimes it's misaligned, but I think it's a good framework to go back to. And it sounds like, again, like active listening is intentional. It's a skill you constantly need to work on. Another question I had too is, I'm sure that there are many of these, but what's the next either problem or situation you're currently trying to solve? What's taking up that brain space?
I have to be honest, probably the same situation of why I joined Miro, which is the challenge of how do you scale a culture as quick as a company in hypergrowth scales, and more specifically for us is how do we maintain and grow a culture as collaborative as our product is. So anyone who's used Miro knows it's super collaborative, and we want the culture to foster that as well. And I think specifically for us is how do we do that, like I said, through onboarding, to creating thriving hubs and communities in different locations, through the empowered teams and agile coaching space of accelerating, forming, storming, norming of teams, and then by ensuring sort of different learning solutions and experiences enable team members to create baseline learning at Miro, but then also stretch and extend themselves. There's just so many components, and I'm just talking about sort of what design team does, but then how do we really work with other parts of the people team, people excellence, recruitment, and then more broadly around with our customers, the business functions to do that. So that is the challenge of just like, you know, kind of keeps you up at night, but it excites you. And I think anyone in a hyper growth or scale up environment would resonate with that.
Absolutely. How do you kind of grow the culture, understand the dynamic process from 100 employees to 200 to 1,000, and people are working in all different, you know, facets of their lives as well. So it is a large question. Is there kind of advice you have as a must-have that people leaders really need to incorporate in their strategy to be successful in the future? It's just a non-negotiable.
Okay, is it one, or can I come up with two?
Yeah, you can do two.
One with the heads. I'll do one with the heads and one with the hearts. So the heads version is, you know, how I said strategy is the how. It's more of the strategic direction. Like I'm always surprised by people who haven't thought about the vision and the purpose. So like must have, like if you've got a strategy and financial plans and capacity planning, resource allocation, cool, like must haves. But the must have on top of that, if people want to know the why, like the research is there. So giving the why in terms of the broader North Star and that purpose, must have. And then the hearts version of the must have is creating psychological safety and having true, vulnerable, but candid, like the radical candid conversations must have.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. Psychological safety is something that I believe in, you know, AllVoices as a whole believes in as well. So definitely +1. Is there, I'm sure there are many of these too, but a people leader in the space that you also admire, and why?
In the space, I'm going to maybe answer rather than in the space, but the best people leaders I've had, just I'll go time and time again, I'm just like, yes, they inspire me. So it was my former leaders. So I had Matt Coates and Jane Livesey. They were at PwC Australia and Sydney. And you know, when you have those leaders that see something in you and they believe in you, and that helps you believe in yourself, but then they just push you to take risks, and they scaffold it, but like, that's who I aspire to be. Like, that's the best leadership. They invest time and effort in you, but they're just like, jump off that cliff. Like, you need to go and take those risks. And I think that, and then you visibly see them grow as leaders as well. And you're like, this is where my journey can go. Hands down, the best leadership I've had to date. And I am very grateful to those two individuals amongst so many others, but it's just, you know, there's anchoring moments in your career and life, and those leaders were anchoring points for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely agree that you remember the really great leaders and what you try to emulate from them as well, and you remember the not great ones too. But the great ones outshine them, which is really good and important to highlight. as well. I know I asked you a variety of questions around kind of Miro strategy, your personal path to the company and this space.
Yeah.
Is there anything, that I didn't ask that you want to share, or 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope the audience brings with them after listening to our conversation today?
I think the only thing that's really new that I haven't added is probably just really looking at your own journey as a leader. Like I think, like I said, the team comes first. It's about the team. It's about the strategy. But looking at your own stages of adult development and your own growth, and taking time to pause and reflect. Like I often say, you can't pour from an empty cup. So taking that time to recharge and really be critically kind, but also analytic of your own journey as one. And then I think just like time and time again, the reason I get up every day is the team. The team is the start game, the end game, and just like people always say, like I end up smiling when I talk about the team. So I'm just so grateful to the brilliance, to the tenacity, and to the fun we have as well. So that would be my final thoughts.
I love that. I mean, I clearly see that you're passionate about the team and the work that you're doing as well. A lot of smiles throughout this interview. If you're listening to this as a podcast, definitely want to note that. But Ness, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I enjoyed our conversation today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christina. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in the employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement to get all voices into the conversation for the company to succeed. We'll speak soon.